So first of all, your book is about service. Everybody else that stops being Prime Minister does an autobiography or a memoir. And people find being a Prime Minister interesting. You know, being a number 10, how you take decisions, what you choose to do, the events you face. Why did you choose to kind of swerve that?
I've never been a great fan of political memoirs, I have to confess. There are some people who just suck them up. Everyone that comes out love to read them. I've never been in that sort of, in that camp. But I do like talking about the substance. And that's why I wanted to do this book, because when I left Number 10 and started to reflect on my time there and in the Home Office, there were just these issues that had this underlying theme to them, which was about power rather than service.
Yeah, but I get that. And what I slightly struggled with was the idea that we needed an ex-Prime Minister to tell us that, you know, power is a little bit corrupting and some people in power aren't in it for the right reasons and actually the people at the bottom get squashed. I mean, didn't we already know that?
Well, if we already knew it, why have we done nothing about it?
Touché.
And that, you know, in a sense is, I hope it's going to be raise awareness and people will look at the issue. You're right, in the past people have said, some people have said that, but I hope people will look at the issue again and say, actually, is there something more that we need to do?
Well, right at the start of the book, you talk about being a minister's daughter and that's kind of a good training ground for politics because, you know, watching your dad, he served the whole community. It was also, in your position as his daughter, you had to act in a way that didn't bring the church into disrepute, him into disrepute. And it just, you know, there's a bit of me, I just wanted to ask, and because I've got you here, I'm going to. If you never just wanted to get wrecked and go dancing in a bar at 3 a.m, completely, you know, having downed a bottle of Prosecco and 3 pink gins, no?
Are you talking about my current life? Or?
Yes, I mean, at any point.
At any point, yes. No, I mean, I wasn't a very rebellious child as the child of the vicarage. I mean, I wasn't even, I can tell you the story that when I expressed an interest at actually quite a young age in joining the Young Conservatives locally, and they came to say, would I like to go to their first party, and it was a Vickers and Tarts party, and I wasn't allowed to go.
Oh, I was going to say, but you had the dog collar sitting in your dad's cupboard, like you were halfway there. No. But there was a bit in the book where you said that you thought at one point your mum wanted you to become a nun. And I listened to a podcast you did earlier in the week, and you were asked about it, and you said it again, and you said that it wasn't for you, and you said it with such a chuckle that it was quite kind of revealing, like you were never going to do this. And I was just kind of wondering, because the kind of public perception of you is that actually there's probably nothing in vows of kind of poverty and chastity and obedience that you wouldn't be cool with, or is there?
Can you imagine spending your entire life wearing the same black outfit every day?
Well, I could, because I don't care about clothes.
Well, so, you see, and also think about the shoes. I mean, you know, that would have been a real.
So yeah, you can't be a nun because of the sacrifice of the shoes. Fair enough. In terms of what you've talked about, and I'm interested in this space, particularly because what Alistair Campbell used to say about not doing God in things, and somebody that grew up in the church, this Church of Scotland myself, is that quite often people talk about the membership of their church, and you've talked about your dad as a minister and a rector and all the rest of it, but they don't actually talk about their faith. Should we be more open to talking about faith in politics?
I think perhaps we do need to talk more about faith, but not necessarily about particular faith. I think that is where, because, you know, a Prime Minister, a Member of Parliament represents people of all faiths and none. So I think the sense that there is something that imbues you with a set of values, I think is something that we should talk about, and talk about the values and the principles that actually lie behind what we do. And I'm not the only former Prime Minister who's a minister's daughter, a vicar's daughter. Gordon Brown, of course, was
he wasn't a daughter, but
close. Sorry. Yes, that is true, yes. The child of a minister.
Child of the manse,
yes.
Yeah. And well, actually, some people might kind of put you in a grouping, actually, with a kind of character grouping with Gordon Brown in terms of wanting to talk about substance rather than talking about yourself, having a more reserved and less flashy style. People might also put somebody like Keir Starmer in that grouping, in terms of you're more roundhead than cavalier.
That's interesting, because I think had I lived in those times, I would have been a royalist.
Right.
So, but I think there is something in today's world of politics And it partly reflects the age of celebrity that we live in, where it's too easy, in a sense, for politicians to feel that it's about them and how they present themselves rather than about the substance. And that actually, when you are in politics, you're there to improve people's lives, and I always want to talk about the issues rather than about how I felt when I did something.
Oh yeah, I know, and I know you've always complained. You hate those questions about how did you feel.
Yes.
So I've gone through this list in front of me. I've taken out all the feely questions. But as somebody who was involved in the party at the time that you were leader, I mean, I used to want to throw cushions at the telly sometimes when you were on, because you didn't talk about your own touch points to an issue. Because actually, one of the ways that people can understand issues is through the stories that we tell. And I'm trying to think of examples. Okay, so when you were in office as Prime Minister, there was a big anniversary of the suffragettes, and you made a big speech, and it was written up everywhere, and you unveiled a statue in Parliament Square. Oh, it was great. And at no point did you ever say, oh yeah, and my godmother's mum used to march to the Pankhursts, and her dad was a Pankhurst family doctor, and we've chatted about it, and I've been up to the Pankhurst house and stuff, and I would have loved to have heard that. Why didn't you tell us that, women? Come on, tell us it.
I suppose it was because at the time I thought, and I was there as Prime Minister, and I probably thought I didn't think anybody would be interested in my godmother's mother. It was there with a major message about the person we were celebrating, which was Millicent Fawcett, rather than about a personal connection that I might have had.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on that, because you're a smart woman. You're also the only second ever female Prime Minister that we had at that point. The idea that people that were fighting for women to be allowed to engage in politics, the idea that you had a personal connection to the people that went on the march, you think people wouldn't have been interested in that?
Well, maybe that's, yes. I mean, I think genuinely it would, and also I think the other thing for me would have been that I was there as Prime Minister. I was there representing, if you like, the country and Parliament, not just my party, but collectively representing the Parliament, and therefore it wouldn't be right to inject something that was very personal and particular to me. We obviously have a difference of opinion on this.
You can see by my face.
I can see.
This is radio, yes. So yeah, but flabbergasted. In terms of the book itself, I mean, it's called The Abuse of Power, and you lay out a number of abuses that you've seen during your time. Issues like Grenfell, like Rotherham, like Hillsborough, Pestminster, which I want to talk a bit more about actually. But you also include Brexit, and I'm interested that you see that in the same category as all those things I just mentioned.
Yes, it's in a slightly different category, and what I do in the book is there's, if you like, three sections. There's a sort of political section, a social injustice section, and an international section. So Hillsborough, Grenfell, Rotherham, those fit in the social injustices section. But I have put Brexit in the political section because what I saw in Brexit, what I feel I saw, was in the House of Commons, increasingly over time, on both sides of the argument, if you like, hardliners on both sides of the argument, using the power they had at that time to put forward their own view rather than necessarily thinking about what was going to work for the whole of the country. And what I wanted to do was deliver Brexit, but do in a way that recognised 48% had voted Remain.
Well, I think also what's in there is you talk about some of the way in which, in the kind of the rush to get to Brexit, there was a sense of wanting to just circumvent some of the rules that existed. And this is maybe post your time, but also in some of the ways you talk about proroguing of Parliament and John Bercow and some of these other things. And there is a question in there about that kind of end justifies the means. And I wonder, because you also talk about the Capitol riots in America, and I think of what happened there, things like proroguing Parliament, things like trying to bend the economic rules in terms of Liz Truss acting or trying to do Reaganomics without us being the currency of last resort and being caught out by it. And whether, for people that are small c conservative as well, that like rules, that there's maybe a safety in rules, that actually the world order exists not as something that threatens us, but something that keeps us safe.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that society lives by a set of rules. I think that but there is an issue today in world politics. I say that politics has become more absolutist and more polarised, and I think we do see that particularly in the United States. And there's less of a sense of abiding by those rules, and there's more of a sense, as you've used the phrase, of the end justifying the means. And this is, I think, problematic for us, because democracy depends on people having trust in the people they elect. And part of that trust, it seems to me, is the sense that there is a set of rules by which people will operate. And they won't flout those, they won't try and ignore them.
Yeah, and also that they're making decisions for the right reasons. So, I mean, for example, in terms of some of the kind of chaotic summer that we had last summer, it seemed as if the course that was being plotted was an ideological course, and the people that paid the price were people that have had their mortgages put up 6 times in the last 6 months. Do you know what I mean? And it's not as if the pursuit was for the greater good. Does that make any sense?
Yes, I see. I mean, I suppose those who were involved might say that they were doing what they thought was right for the greater good. But I think you do get, sometimes that does touch over into that sense of doing something simply because you have an ideological belief in it rather than because you can see it's for the greater good. And that's partly, I suppose, what I was getting at in putting the references to abuse of power in relation to Brexit in the book, that there was that sense on both sides of they knew what was right for them in terms of what they had sort of campaigned for, believed in, the hard line on one side, wanting a hardest of hard Brexits, the hard line on the Remainer side, wanting a second referendum and overturning the result of the first referendum, rather than saying, actually, you know what, we've got a result, but it was very close, let's just see what fits more people, what is there for you've used the term the greater good, what is there for the national interest, the common interest.
Is there something based in that? Is there just a big chunk of politicians that have a God complex?
I don't think they've got a God complex, but I think there is an issue in politics today which is more about power than service.
Well, that comes across in the book, particularly at the end. You do an entire kind of chapter on the idea of service and why people need to have more of it. And the reason I asked about the kind of the God complex, maybe there's the wrong word, but it's this idea that rules don't apply. And we saw that with some of the kind of lockdown issues that happened in Number 10 and elsewhere. And I find it astonishing that there are still people that don't understand why huge swathes of the country are appalled by what happened. I'm appalled by what happened. But also even in smaller things. So I said I'd come back and talk about Westminster, and you had to deal with it a bit when you were Prime Minister. And I don't get that after we had a Me Too moment in Parliament, and you were having to encourage people like Michael Fallon to quit and all sorts of stuff, that we're still seeing case after case of it. People either think the way they're behaving is acceptable, or they know that it's not, but for some reason they think they're the one that's going to get away with it. And I can't get the mindset.
It is, I think, all too often in politics, in the House of Commons, in the cases that we've seen, and the cases that have been written about by the various reports that we've had, is this sense that somehow being an MP sets you apart. I remember, I had the conversation in the tea room once, at a very early stage in my time in Westminster, with a long-standing MP who is no longer in the House, hasn't been in the House for a while. But he heard me refer to being an MP as a job. And he looked at me and said, no, it's not a job. We're elected. It's not a job. I said, yes, it is a job. And we are there to work for the people who elect us. We get the job in a different way from most people who just go for an interview and then get appointed. But at core, we're working for other people, we're serving other people. It is a job, we're not a breed apart. And I think sometimes what happens when people enter those hallowed walls of Parliament is they feel they're a breed apart, the rules don't apply to them, and they can behave in ways which in other circumstances are regarded as completely unacceptable. They are unacceptable, and increasingly we're seeing Parliament recognise that.
There's some great quotes in the book. My favourite that I read was when you were writing about wokeness. You said the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of woke is well-informed, up-to-date and chiefly alert to racial discrimination and injustice. And on that basis, who would not want to be woke? It invites the question, Theresa, are you happily a woke woman?
In the terms of that definition of somebody who recognises that discrimination takes place, sadly, that term has come to be used again as part of this absolutism and polarisation of politics.
So you are woke and proud?
Yeah. Do you remember, it's a bit like being asked in the old days, was I a feminist?
Yes.
And I wore a T-shirt which said, "This is what a feminist looks like."
You were told by, I believe, Harriet Harman that you might be a woman, but you are no sister.
Well, that was some time ago. I have to say, Harriet, and there was a time when the Labour Party, I think, genuinely found it difficult to see the Conservative Party taking women's issues seriously. I think what we've shown over the legislation on domestic abuse...
Don't give me the proper politician's answer. Tell me, did she piss you off?
Well...
It would have pissed me off.
I tell you what it did. No, I'll tell you what it did. It's a slightly different reaction. Was it made me more determined to show that we were taking those issues seriously.
Well, I was upset for you. I dropped a paragraph into my conference speech that year to have a go at her because I knew you couldn't defend yourself. And because it was the year that she was driving a pink bus around for Labour, and I was a bit like, come on, lads. You know, we've got our second female PM here, and you're doing that. Anyway, sorry. Old wars. In terms of your time in politics, let's start with the Home Office, because one of your really, really big kind of policy triumphs, and one of the things that have defined your political journey, was the modern slavery legislation and your commitment to that. Your commitment, even now, you're about to launch a big campaign on it. Did it bother you at the time that you were running to become Prime Minister after David Cameron left office that he and George Osborne were quietly going around telling everybody that would listen that wasn't actually your issue, that they'd given you that issue to give you something sort of majorly chunky to get your teeth into?
Well, first of all, I didn't know they were running around saying
all right, okay.
that.
Sorry.
So, by definition, in answer to your question, it didn't bother me at the time because I didn't know about it.
Right.
But it was not the first time that I've been involved in that issue, because I'd actually done some work on it in the form, in the slightly narrower sense of human trafficking, which of course is part of modern slavery. But I'd done work on that when we were in opposition.
Right, okay. When they were just boys in short trousers?
I think possibly when David was leader, actually, in opposition.
Okay.
So
okay. One of the other big issues, and I know that you will tell me that this was a phrase that was pioneered by Labour, but it became known during your time in the Home Office, was this sense of hostile environment, which was kind of popularised. You've spoken before about how you regret it. For me, I'm looking at the papers today, I'm looking at what's happened this week, and it still seems to be framing the debate on immigration.
I think the point of the phrase, you're right, it was used by Labour before it was used by us in government. And the point of it, under both governments, was to deal with illegal immigration. Unfortunately, what happened was it came to be a term that people felt applied more widely. I think dealing with immigration is not, there's no single answer that suddenly transforms the position on immigration. At the Home Office, you have to cover a whole wide variety of aspects of it in order to be dealing with it. And there's longer term issues. If you want to ensure that immigration is, as most people want, I think they want to see it's fair, but that it's managed and there is some control on numbers. But we actually need to ensure that fewer people feel the need to migrate to Western countries like the UK. And that's about our international development money. It's about how we help countries develop their own economies. It's about how we deal with climate change, which will exacerbate migration.
Isn't there an argument, though, that somebody in politics, whether it's Labour or us, hopefully us, somebody should have the guts to stand up and actually say migration isn't inherently bad? That the idea that you want to pick up yourself and your family and move halfway across the world to make a better life for yourself, to contribute to a society, to help generate wealth, that these are good things. In fact, some people might even say they're conservative things.
Well, and I've always said that immigration has been good for the country. I think the concern that people have is always around numbers, and often actually the people who feel most about this issue are people who see least migration in their own communities. I mean, you look at somewhere like London, which is hugely diverse, and it's not the issue in London that it might be in some other parts of the country.
Now, I need you to confirm a story for me, and I'm praying that this one is true because I really hope it is. That during the London Olympics, you were Home Secretary, that I was told by someone very senior that part of the kind of security protocols and the scenario planning was that certain key members of the cabinet had to be given kind of training and do simulation on if there was a terrorist attack by air, a kind of Twin Towers attack, on when you gave the green light for a plane to be shot out of the sky. And that the members of the cabinet reacted exactly as you would think they would. so that Philip Hammond, who was Defence Secretary, was practically shooting down, DHL planes in Vancouver, whereas Nick Clegg as Deputy PM wouldn't give the order for love nor money. The plane could be 2 centimetres from the podium in the middle of the stadium, and that the only person that went through the training that got everything right was you.
Well, I hadn't heard of that aspect of it. It wasn't, the training isn't just for the Olympics. There has to be these days, sadly, a situation where if something looks as if it's posing a threat here in the UK, a plane looks as if it's posing a threat here in the UK, obviously post 9/11, looking at this, then the Prime Minister has to take, be on call to take a decision if necessary. And
it's Prime Minister. You didn't do that.
No,
as Home
I did it as Home Secretary. I was going to come on to say, because obviously the Prime Minister isn't always in the country. The Prime Minister not be available, so a group of cabinet ministers are trained to do that as well. And I was trained as Home Secretary, and then obviously had the responsibility as Prime Minister as well.
Sorry, do you not just have an odd moment when somebody's teaching you this stuff, or the day that you get handed the bat phone and it's your first on-call night? Do you not just? I mean, I would find that responsibility very difficult.
It is a huge responsibility. Yes, it is, and it is. It's quite, because of course, for most people, they don't know they're going to be presented with this responsibility when they go into one of the major offices. But yes, you have to do it. But it's part of being in an office like Home Secretary or Prime Minister is a huge privilege, but it bears with it very significant responsibility.
Yeah, the one that I find odd is the idea that when you become Prime Minister, you're asked to sit down and write a letter to the captains of the nuclear submarines about what they should do if they can't get in contact with us, and assume that a nuclear wipeout of the UK has taken place. What did you write in yours?
Nobody will know.
You're not allowed to tell me whether you said fire back, don't fire, put yourself under the control of the Americans, which I believe are the three choices that you're...
You don't tell anybody. You do it on your own. Uh-huh. So you obviously you get a briefing about issues and so forth, but then everybody leaves the room and you do it on your own, so they don't know what you've put in those envelopes. You seal those envelopes and they go to the appropriate places, and they will only be opened in the case of necessity, which fortunately was not the case.
Yes, fortunately was not the case. But if for example, one of your options is to put yourselves under the control of the Americans, and the President of the United States happens to be Donald Trump at the time, does that change your thinking process?
Well, you have to look, when you're looking at the issue, you look at it objectively and not about individuals.
Well, you've got a whole section in your book about international politics, and people are often fascinated by Donald Trump because he's a fascinating character, and I know you've been asked about him sort of grabbing your hand before. I mean, that was weird, but I think the thing that I found at the time more kind of outrageous was when he started talking about why you were Prime Minister and not Boris Johnson and some of these other things. And again, it's that breaking of protocol, the idea that rules don't apply, and whether that's a good way of governing or not.
Well, he was a president like no other, and the unpredictability, I think, was the key thing, I would say, around Donald Trump. You would not normally expect a president of the United States to be talking in those terms. I think nobody would be surprised to know that he probably got on better with Boris than he did with me.
I mean, can you even conceive of the idea that he might be coming back?
Well, it's up to the American people to decide. It's up to the American people to decide. I think here in the UK, most of us would find it difficult. I mean, in the circumstances where somebody is actually going through trials and has a number of charges against them, including one which is about the election result last time on, obviously the ones in Georgia.
Yeah, but I get all of that, but the Constitution allows that he could be in jail and still be president. I mean, that is the rules. But what gets me is that the party isn't stepping in at this point, because they have huge power too.
Well, I think that we could spend a very long time discussing about the Republican Party in the United States. I think one of the issues that I would say is that if you look at the United States, I think there is a question as to where are the younger members on both sides, on the Republicans and Democrats, coming forward for the future.
Now, let's talk about elections, because you mentioned the election result in the States there. I'm possibly the only Tory in the whole of the party that thoroughly enjoyed the 2017 snap election campaign and was delighted when you called it. But at that time, I mean, the polls were looking great for us. I mean, talk me through that. You went on a walking holiday with Philip, you decided, you came back, you made the announcement. I mean, presumably it was, I can't get Brexit through, I need to have a majority that's bigger than this, let's go, or what was the thought?
It was a couple of things. And first of all, of course, we did well in Scotland in 2017. And thank you for all the effort you put into that.
I love elections. I'd fight an election every year if I could. That's the best bit of politics for me. So yeah, there was no hardship for me.
I mean, there were a couple of reasons why I called that election. One was about the majority, because I'd hoped from everything that we'd been seeing in the polls that be able to get a bigger majority. So I've said this in the House of Commons, I've said it publicly elsewhere, the result in 2019 that Boris got was supposed to be the result we got in 2017, but there we are. But there was another issue, which was about the timing of what would have been the next election alongside Brexit. And actually, having the election in 2017 gave us that space, that time, to ensure that the next election would not have come immediately on top of Brexit. So we could have done Brexit, dealt with it, moved on.
The team around you were pretty confident. I don't know if you know this, but one of your co-chiefs of staff sat me down and all but offered me a seat that was on the 100 target list, and I thankfully said no, because we certainly didn't win it. And I had a job to do in Scotland, which I was happy to do, thanks very much. But was there a point from where the stellar poll rating started and this assumption that there was going to be gains, was there a point where you knew now there's going to be losses?
I don't think it was. There's a point where I started to get worried, which was there was a Savanta poll that was different from the other polls, and but there was a sort of, experts were saying, well, this was a rogue poll, it was something to do with the way they'd put it together, and so forth. That I think, from my point of view, what I wasn't getting and what I should have insisted on was the ability to knock on doors every day, because I'm a campaigner who likes to be out there knocking on those doors, and it's those doorsteps that tell me where people are and what their feeling is. And I wasn't getting that direct connection with people.
Right. So there wasn't a point then that you thought, oh my God, I might lose the actual election, never mind just lose a majority?
There was a point when I started worrying about it, but again, in general, people were still thinking that this was going to be okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's different types of elections. So there's like change elections and there's continuity elections. It feels to me that the election that's coming in the next 12 to 18 months is going to probably be a change election. And I think that poses questions to us as a party about what our election message has to be. But if we aren't successful, what it looks like afterwards. And we're on our 5th Prime Minister. We've undone a lot of the things that David Cameron did and you did. So I can't see what our narrative is.
Well, I think, first of all, I'm going to be working hard to make sure...
That's what I want the Conservatives to do.
Exactly, it's not a change election. I mean, I think the two important things I would say, and I think it's right that people want a party that delivers for them, and Rishi is working on delivering on what he has set out as the people's priorities in those 5 areas.
Have you ever offered him advice? PM to PM?
I don't think it's right for former PMs to go around trying to offer advice, because each PM has to deal with a different set of circumstances. But so it's right to be showing and working hard to deliver for people. I think critical is going to be the economy. I mean, it always is. Obviously, 3 of the 5 pledges are about 5 priorities are about the economy, and with every prospect of inflation coming down, halving by the end of the year, as he's set out, people starting to feel things are better. I think that gives us the opportunity.
You've still got your message discipline. It's never left you.
No, people say to me, oh, X is the issue for the election. Y is the issue. The economy is always the issue for people at the election.
Okay. Let's ask some non-kind of political questions or kind of more general ones. Is there a particular thing when you look back on your time in Number 10 that was like the toughest thing?
I think trying to get my Brexit deal through the House of Commons was pretty tough.
3 times.
Yes. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you.
No, I was a supporter. I was wanting it through.
Yes.
Yeah, I much prefer your deal than the one that we ended up getting.
There we are. I think the toughest moments for Prime Ministers are things like when, I had to take the decision alongside the French and the Americans to send our planes into Syria to bomb the chemical weapons factories. And when you do that, there's a chance that some of them might not come back. So when you're actually putting your forces into action, I think that's the toughest thing.
Jeez. I mean, I know this is going to sound weird, but I'm just doing it as a reflection of that, because that is not a usual workplace experience, fair to say. Like, what does Philip think when you go home and say, I've just done this? Or how does he view what you had to do in your time in office? Well,
I'm hugely fortunate, and Philip was hugely supportive. And I think...
Did he go down to a 4-day week to help with the household admin? Did I hear that?
Yes.
See, why did you go on telly and talk about girl jobs and boy jobs, where you could have said, he's given up a day at work to come and help run the household? What? Theresa!
Probably because he didn't really want me to talk about that. So,
But you were the Prime Minister!
Yes,
people
but I
would
was
love
that. Well, people might have done, but I think he would have got a lot of letters from men saying, "Why did you give up a day?"
So,
yes.
So just think of all the men that think, "Oh, do you know, actually, that's a really good idea. I could maybe do that and help out a bit more." Sorry, I'm not telling you how to run your marriage. I've gone off on a tangent here. Let's pull it back. Let's pull it back. Sorry.
I'm trying to think how many would have been in that position.
Yeah, but in terms of kind of reflections, it must have been hard for him as well when you come in from a day like that.
Yes, it is. I always think in politics, actually, it's the other half for whom it is hardest, because they see the stress, they can feel the stress, but they're not there to do anything. They're not participating in the decisions. They're not, in that sense, there and part of it. So they just get the backlash. So I've always said I think it is really hard for the other halves of politicians.
Yeah, amen to that. Are you happier now you're not Prime Minister?
Well, I'm free. Well, I was pretty happy being Prime Minister. It was stressful, but I was happy doing it. But I'm freer these days, which is I can focus. You mentioned the modern slavery issue. I'm setting up a global commission on modern slavery and human trafficking, so able to focus on issues that matter to me.
Do you know, that is so much more worthy than the question that I was about to ask you as a follow-up, which is, have you got any more hobbies now you've got more time? Because we know you like cooking, we know you like fashion, but do you do anything, have you got time for yourself or time to do something that you've always wanted to do or that you enjoy doing more than you used to have?
I have more time to read novels than I had. I do have more time to cook. Philip did a count up the other day. I don't know whether this was a message to me. He said, you've now got 275 cookery books in the kitchen, so okay, right.
I can't believe you went through and counted them. Okay, in terms of sort of last questions, people know that one of your passions, I don't know if this counts as a hobby or an activity, but one of your passions is cricket. There's been a great deal of upheaval in the English cricket scene. Do you approve of Bazball or not? This is very important.
It is a very important question, and I'll be perfectly honest. I was sceptical about it. Geoffrey Boycott was always my, the cricketer that I admired.
Occupied a crease, did Geoffrey.
Occupied a crease, yes.
Knew what to do in the
Straight
corridor of
bat,
uncertainty.
Yes.
He wasn't for slapping it all around the ground.
No, that's right. But actually, what Bazball has done is given the team, given the Test team particularly, a greater sense of what can be done, I think, a greater sense of what can be achieved, and of actually going out there and enjoying it. And I think you see that from them.
Yeah, do you know, I'm fully on board with it. There's a bit of me that thinks that actually Tests should be played in a proper manner, but then I am small C conservative as well as a large C one. But there was a bit just before the Ashes series where they were talking about they weren't just going to win, they were going to change the game of cricket. And I was like, ooh, you've tipped over into a bit of hubris there, lads. Got to be a bit careful.
Well, but in a sense, but cricket has changed, hasn't it? And I think this is, you see, I think that a lot of people were sceptical when the 100 was introduced, but actually you look at the crowds that go to see the 100, particularly the families. You look at the young girls who are now taking an interest in cricket, and I think it's doing a really good job, as long as test matches stay, so that you have a spectrum through from the 100 through the various limited overs and county cricket, and you have those longer tests. But people want to be able to go to see something that is going to be exciting. And the one thing, I'm sorry that we didn't manage to regain the Ashes, but we drew the Test series, and the matches were really interesting, really exciting.
Yeah, they really were. It was like 2005 level of interest. Coming back to more serious issues, on the 2017 campaign, one of the issues that we said it was in our manifesto that I've been interested in was that we said that we were going to reform gender recognition. And in 2017, you said you laid out plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act, streamlining and demedicalising the process for changing gender, because being trans is not an illness and it should not be treated as such. Well, one, do you still think that? And two, what's your response to how the trans issue has played out over the last 6 years?
I think it's very unfortunate how it has played out over the last 6 years, because I think it's an issue on which what we want is calm reflection and consideration. And it's been it's polarised and very polarised. And I think actually it shouldn't be. It should be one where we can sit down together. There will be people of different views, but we need to sit down together and think of those who, the reason I said what I did, is, and we had obviously the consultation, is just saying, actually we need to think about the people who are involved here and have a sensitive approach to them rather than taking these polarised positions.
Now, I'm aware we're coming to the end of our time, so just for the last couple, I'm interested in how long it took you to decompress. Like, how long does it take you to recover from being a Prime Minister?
Well, I'm tempted to. I mean, you've been through the process of decompressing from a leadership role into a different...
And I found it hard. I took about 18 months, and, I have no kind of, qualms or kind of delusions about the order of magnitude of difference of being an opposition leader in Scotland and being the leader of a G7 nation. Like, just in terms of the gap is massive. So if I took 18 months, I mean, that's why I'm interested.
I'm not sure I've got a sort of period of time that's in mind. I felt the next day when I went to watch some cricket at Lord's, I felt pretty decompressed.
I cheersed you because you had a glass with you and you were at Lord's, and I was just thinking, fair play to you. I think the country just went, good on you, love.
Yes. But it's also because I stayed in the House of Commons and was still doing my constituency work. So part of what I had been doing, I was still continuing to do. But it was, I think it was that sense initially of, actually, I've now got time to think about the issues that I'm really interested in. And I've always been interested in my constituency. My colleague Charles Walker tells the story that it was a few parliamentary days after I'd stepped down, I was in the tea room and the then Secretary of State for Transport came in, and Charles thought, this could be a sort of, difficult moment because, Theresa's no longer in office, etc., etc. But I'm afraid what I said to him was, Secretary of State. I've got an issue with my railway going through my constituency.
I think a lot of people have been very impressed in the way in which you become an ex-Prime Minister, because there's a way of doing it well and a way of doing it badly. And in terms of your contribution from the backbenchers, you've been rightly kind of lauded on it. But one of your aides told me that not long after the changeover of Prime Minister, Boris had invited a whole bunch of the parliamentary party into Number 10 for a drinks session, and you went. And it just strikes me that actually takes quite a lot of courage to go back into Number 10 as not Prime Minister, like a month after you leave office.
Yes, I mean, it's because it brings back so many memories, and you kind of think, somebody else is here now. But because I
planted that gold wallpaper much.
Didn't get to see the wallpaper.
Okay.
But we, I think, because I'd gone back to the backbenches, I wanted to be that backbench MP, and therefore it was right that I went along with my colleagues.
And in terms of summing up your period in office, you wouldn't be human if you didn't kind of look at the scores on the board and chalk up the wins and the losses. What's your overarching sense of that period and the period since?
Well, it was a difficult period. I hope, I mean, look, it's always going to be seen in terms of Brexit and not getting my deal through. But I would hope people will be able to look behind that and see things like the 2050 net zero legislation, which I think is really important, the work that was started for a new Domestic Abuse Act, the work we did for a new Mental Health Act, which still hasn't come through, but I hope will come through. There's a lot of work being done on that, the modern industrial strategy, the 25-year environment plan. A lot else was going on, but of course, the headline was always Brexit.
It was. Theresa May, thank you very much.
Thank you.